I pulled up outside the facility and was immediately confused. It looked dilapidated and hardly like a proper place for childcare. A rusted gate blocked the entrance, and I was about to turn around and leave when I noticed movement behind it. An old, frail man stepped out from the shadows and began to unlock the gate, then motioned for me to drive through. I drove past him, offering a smile and a thank you. His face was obscured by a hood, making it impossible to get a clear look. He vanished into a tent just inside the gate. I stepped out of the car and stared at the building, which looked like it could collapse at any moment. A woman, probably in her 60s, rushed out and told me they had been expecting me. I wanted to explain that I must have come to the wrong place, but I couldn't get a word in. She was speaking a mile a minute. She led me inside and we began walking down a dim, gloomy hallway. She introduced herself as Evans and explained that I would be dealing with a very special group of children, and that I needed to be careful around them. The regular teacher had been gone for a week, and I had been brought in as a temporary replacement. She handed me a piece of paper, telling me that it contained the mandatory rules, and that I'd be fine as long as I followed them. Then she opened a door and pushed me inside before slamming it shut behind me. I stood there, stunned, staring at the door. I heard a sneeze behind me and turned to see dozens of children watching me. I quickly pulled myself together and slipped the paper into my pocket. I introduced myself, and their attention drifted back to whatever they'd been doing before I entered. A girl with heterochromatic eyes, one blue, one golden, approached and introduced herself as Emily. She asked if I could hand her a pair of scissors for her art project. I gave them to her and smiled, surprised by her politeness. She smiled back, and I flinched when I noticed her mouth had no teeth at all. She returned to her table and began slicing through strips of paper. Her blue eyes suddenly glowed red for a brief moment before she walked over to the nearest boy. Before I could react, Emily drove the scissors straight into the boy's throat. A spray of bright red blood burst forth as she stood there giggling. The other children continued working as if nothing had happened, even as blood soaked them. The blood didn't seem to stop flowing, and soon it began dripping from the ceiling. My clothes were drenched. I wiped my face and felt panic setting in as I realized how much blood there actually was. I bolted from the room, screaming for help, and ran straight into Mrs. Evans at the end of the hallway. She scolded me for leaving the children unsupervised, not even acknowledging my frantic attempts to explain what had just happened. She practically dragged me back to the classroom, and I just stood there in shock as I looked around the room. The blood was completely gone, and the children were seated as if nothing had happened. The boy who had been stabbed in the throat was perfectly fine now. My clothes were clean too, no trace of blood anywhere, and I could see the displeased expression on Mrs. Evans's face. She carefully retrieved the scissors from Emily's desk while the little girl sat there with that same toothless grin. It was a terrifying smile, and I could tell that even Mrs. Evans was afraid of her. That's probably why she handed me the scissors instead and reminded me firmly that I needed to follow the rules. The rest of the day passed quietly, but I kept catching the children glancing at me, watching me in a way that never felt normal. The only time I truly had a moment of peace was during nap time, when all the kids lay down to sleep. I was immensely relieved when Mrs. Evans showed up and told me I could go home. When I got home and was unpacking my things, I found the list of rules again. I read them over and over, trying to make sense of what had just happened and of what I had gotten myself into. It was the most bizarre and unsettling set of rules I had ever come across. They read as follows. 1. Do not, under any circumstance, give Emily the scissors. 2. If any of the children begin floating during nap time, do not approach them. Sing "Never Gonna Give You Up" by Rick Astley until their bodies return to the floor. 3. Never tell the children where you live or leave your wallet where they can reach it. 4. Do not allow the children to hold hands and form a circle. Use a fire extinguisher to break them apart if necessary. 5. Lastly, and most importantly, if a child begins peeling their skin, close your eyes and start praying out loud. Do not open your eyes or stop praying until the gurgling screams cease. As I read the rules, I suddenly felt a cold nose brush against my leg. I reached down and began petting my dog, Larry. I had to lift him onto the bed beside me. He was too old now to jump up by himself. Most of his teeth had fallen out, and the few that remained were decayed and useless. The next day was unusually quiet. The children sat and played, mostly ignoring me. I left the room to use the restroom, just for a few minutes, and when I came back, I noticed that my wallet had been slightly moved. But I brushed it off as my imagination. That night, when I got home, I immediately knew something was wrong. Larry didn't come to greet me at the door. I screamed when I found his body in the bathtub. Someone had gutted my dog and wrapped his corpse in a sheet. His jaw had been snapped in half, and his eyeballs had been shoved into his gaping mouth. I froze when I heard soft whimpering coming from him, and realized he was still alive. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and slit his throat to end his suffering. That night, I cried myself to sleep. I had raised Larry since he was a puppy. He was part of my family. I was still trembling when I arrived in the classroom, barely able to shake the horrifying image of Larry being tortured from my mind. I sat down, scanning the room while the children played with their toys. My blood ran cold when Emily looked at me and flashed that wide, gaping smile. I stood frozen, staring without really seeing, remembering the dog's teeth from just yesterday. Then she laughed and ran off to play with the others, leaving me numb and dazed. I remained in my seat almost motionless and didn't even realize the children had fallen asleep for their nap. I snapped back to reality when an unbearable heat began to seep into my bones, like boiling water. I looked up and saw every child hovering about a meter off the ground, blankets draping over their bodies. I stood and started crawling toward them. The temperature soared with every step I took, causing the hair on my arms to sizzle in a way I couldn't have imagined. I stumbled backward, on the brink of fainting, when I remembered the rules and began to sing, "Never Gonna Give You Up." As I sang, the bodies slowly descended back to the floor. The heat subsided the moment they all laid down. I stopped singing and just stood there in stunned silence, unable to decide whether to flee or stay. I realized I needed the paycheck. I couldn't just walk away. My arms looked as if they'd been sunburned for hours. I do have, well, beautifully sun-kissed skin. The next morning, Mrs. Evans cornered me in the hallway and asked if I'd followed the rules. Relief washed over her face when I explained that I'd done exactly what I was told. She patted me gently on the back and reminded me, only 2 more days to go. The kids drifted into the room as I walked in, and I got a bad feeling that something terrible was about to happen. My mind kept telling me something was missing in the room, but I couldn't quite pinpoint what. I closed my eyes and tried to visualize the room, searching for what was off. I sat like that for about 5 minutes until I opened my eyes and turned toward the corner where the fire extinguisher still hung. Time seemed to slow as I noticed the children sitting in a tight circle, chanting in a language I couldn't understand, and the air around them shimmered. A small hole formed above their heads, and a clawed hand struggled to reach through. It retracted after a few failed attempts due to the hole's size. I rushed forward, trying to pull the children away, but their bodies were stiff as stone and wouldn't move. The hole widened with every passing second. Beyond it, I could see hundreds of malevolent eyes staring at me, so hateful I felt myself recoil. I dashed out, running until I found the fire extinguisher nearby. I flipped it open, read the instructions quickly, then ran back to the classroom. One creature was halfway through the hole, its skin charred black, the only recognizable feature a pair of glowing red eyes staring right at me. I aimed the nozzle at it and started spraying. It let out a piercing scream and recoiled into the hole. The children's chanting abruptly stopped, and the hole nearly snapped shut. It couldn't pull itself back fully, one of its claws got sheared off. Emily picked it up and swallowed it without hesitation. The children returned to their play, and I just stood there clutching the fire extinguisher. I arrived early the next day, knowing it would be my last few hours in that place. I stepped into the classroom and was relieved to see the fire extinguisher still hanging in its place. The children all smiled at me as if someone had just told them a hilarious joke. The day started off smoothly. I sat down and kept a close eye on them. Their bodies once again began to levitate during nap time, but I started singing before they could fully rise off the ground. The children woke up after their nap, and that unnerving grin returned to each of their faces. Emily reached into her mouth and began tearing at her own flesh with her bare hands. The others quickly followed her lead, stripping the skin from their bodies. You could see every muscle exposed, and their smiles were more sinister than ever. They began moving toward me, and I shut my eyes tight, praying aloud with all my might. Small hands began crawling across my body, and I fought the overwhelming urge to vomit. I cracked one eye open just enough to see another hole forming in the center of the room. Agonizing screams echoed from within, and I could see shadowy figures writhing as if being tortured inside. I don't know how long I kept my eyes closed. It felt like an eternity. I only opened them again when I felt a hand rest gently on my shoulder. Mrs. Evans was standing beside me, thanking me for my help during the week. I grabbed my things and gave one last glance at the children, who were now back to normal. I followed her out the door and felt a massive weight lift off my chest, knowing I would never have to come back. I collected my paycheck for the week and bolted out the door. I never worked another childcare job again after that day, and eventually ended up working in a prison, which honestly felt a lot safer. I can't help but hope that whoever takes my place with those children follows the rules. I truly don't even want to imagine what those kids could do to the world, if left unsupervised.